Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the intense ideological clashes and the truly pivotal negotiations that shaped the Indian independence movement in the early 1930s. Look, this isn't just a dusty history lesson. It's a look at the incredibly high-stakes diplomacy, massive protests, and profound philosophical disagreements that literally forged a nation. So let's just jump right in.
To really wrap our heads around this complex era, we've broken this explainer down into 5 key chapters: the Roundtable Conferences, resuming civil disobedience, the Communal Award, the Purna Pact, and finally, Gandhi's Harijan Campaign. All right, let's get to it.
Chapter 1. The Roundtable Conferences.
So, based on the recommendations of the Simon Commission report, the British government organized 3 distinct roundtable conferences over in London. The goal? To hash out the future of constitutional government in India. Now, these took place over a super tense 2-year period, starting in late 1930 and wrapping up at the end of 1932. But, the dates alone don't really tell the full story here. It's who was, and frankly, who wasn't, sitting at that table that actually matters.
The attendance records for these meetings are super revealing. The biggest takeaway is that the Indian National Congress flat out boycotted both the first and third conferences, and the British quickly realized that without the Congress involved, any sort of consensus was going to be incredibly weak. Meanwhile, you had various other groups like the Muslim League, women's representatives like Sarojini Naidu, and the depressed classes led by B.R. Ambedkar and Retamalai Srinivasan, who attended consistently throughout the whole shebang. Now, when the Congress finally did attend the second conference in 1931, with Mahatma Gandhi stepping in as its sole representative, everything basically ground to a halt. Gandhi claimed to represent all Indians against imperialism and pushed for immediate responsible government, completely arguing against any special safeguards for minorities. But other delegates vehemently disagreed with them. Muslim leaders, the depressed classes, Christians, and Anglo-Indians actually joined forces in what was called a minorities pact, and they demanded separate electorates. Because of this massive clash in vision, the second conference deadlocked completely.
Chapter 2. Resuming civil disobedience.
So, this brings us to a huge question. What actually happens on the ground when high-level international diplomacy completely breaks down? How do everyday people, and the ruling government for that matter, react when you hit a total constitutional brick wall? Well, the answer is massive unrest. On December 29, 1931, the Congress Working Committee decided it was time to resume the civil disobedience movement. And the popular response? Absolutely staggering. Even though the public was pretty much unprepared for this sudden resumption of protests, in just the first 4 months of 1932 alone, roughly 80,000 Satyagrahis, and these were mostly the urban and rural poor, were thrown into jail. 80,000! That's a mind-boggling number for just 4 months.
The British authorities were absolutely determined not to let this movement catch fire again. Viceroy Willingdon enacted what was, for all intents and purposes, a civilian martial law just to crush the protests. Gandhi was swiftly arrested on January 4th, the press was completely gagged, nationalist literature was banned outright, and the source notes that the repression was particularly harsh on women. But, the resistance was fiercely creative. To get around this massive clampdown, activists literally installed a secret radio transmitter near Bombay just to keep their communications flowing. How wild is that?
Moving on to Chapter 3, the Communal Award.
While all this chaos was unfolding in India, over in London on August 16, 1932, British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald made a monumental announcement. Based on the findings of the Lothian Committee, he introduced the Communal Award. This was an absolutely unprecedented move. It officially recognized multiple groups as distinct minorities that required separate, independent political representation in the provincial legislatures. This award wasn't just a broad statement, it was incredibly detailed. It established separate electorates across the board for Muslims, Sikhs, and others. It reserved 3% of seats for women and even carved out specific seats for Marathas in Bombay. But the real kicker, and perhaps the most controversial provision of all, was for the depressed classes. They were granted a double vote for a period of 20 years. This meant they could vote once in a separate electorate exclusively for their own representatives, and then vote a second time in the general electorate. It was a massive deal.
And this set off a huge conflict over political identity. The British, who were aligning with arguments made by leaders like Ambedkar during the conferences, saw this as necessary protection. To them, it was a practical way to give vulnerable groups distinct political identities. Gandhi, on the flip side, saw the Communal Award as a fatal blow to national unity. He viewed it as just another flavor of the British divide-and-rule playbook. He argued that separating the depressed classes politically would deeply fracture Hinduism, and ultimately wouldn't actually solve the problem of their social degradation.
Which leads us to Chapter 4, the Purna Pact.
While still sitting in a prison cell, Gandhi decided to deploy the ultimate moral weapon he had. On September 20th, 1932, he launched an indefinite fast, literally a fast unto death. And this was specifically to protest those separate electorates assigned to the depressed classes. This extreme measure cranked up the pressure to an unimaginable level. It placed immense moral, public, and political weight right on B.R. Ambedkar and other leaders to figure out a compromise, and fast, before Gandhi's health completely failed.
That frantic scramble for a solution gave birth to the Purna Pact, which completely flipped the script on the numbers. Ambedkar agreed to surrender the demand for separate electorates, but in exchange, the number of guaranteed reserved seats for the depressed classes within the general provincial legislatures was more than doubled. We're talking a jump from the 71 seats offered in the Communal Award up to a staggering 147 seats under the Purna Pact.
So the pact was signed on September 24th by B.R. Ambedkar and accepted by the British government. This agreement effectively kept the depressed classes within the broader Hindu electoral fold. On the surface, it looked like a monumental victory for Gandhi's vision of a united national front.
However, if we dig into the historical analysis of the aftermath, things get a lot more complicated. The source material points out some severe, lasting consequences for the Dalits, or the depressed classes. According to the text, the pact essentially turned these classes into political tools for majoritarian organizations. Think about it. Because candidates still had to win in general electorates, it often meant genuine, independent leaders just couldn't compete against those propped up by upper caste organizations. Ultimately, the source argues it subordinated Dalits within the Hindu social order and stunted their ability to develop the independent leadership needed to fight the Brahminical system. It was a compromise, sure, but one with deep generational consequences.
At the philosophical core of this whole era is one really fundamental question. Why did these brilliant leaders disagree so profoundly? Well, it all boils down to their core views on caste itself. B.R. Ambedkar advocated for the absolute annihilation of the caste system. He believed untouchability could literally never be removed as long as caste existed. Gandhi, however, drew a line between the two. He believed untouchability was a sin that absolutely needed to be purged, but, and here's the key, he felt the Varnashram, the caste system itself, wasn't inherently sinful. He envisioned a purified system where different castes were equal and complementary, rather than strictly hierarchical.
Chapter 5: Gandhi's Harijan Campaign. Following the intense drama of the Purna Pact, Gandhi actually stepped back from traditional politics to focus almost entirely on social reform. While he was still locked up, he founded the Anti-Untouchability League. Once he got out, he launched a weekly publication called Harijan and moved to an ashram in Wardha. And from there, he kicked off a grueling 20,000-kilometer national tour. He was out there urging political workers to focus on the social, economic, and cultural upliftment of the Harijans right at the village level. He even went on 2 more fasts in 1934, just to prove to his own followers how dead serious he was about this mission.
But, while Gandhi was out there marching through thousands of villages, pushing for social reform, the constitutional machinery over in London just kept grinding forward. The Third Roundtable Conference wrapped up at the end of 1932, once again completely without the Congress. The recommendations from all these conferences were eventually debated in the British Parliament, and they ended up laying the bureaucratic groundwork for what would become the Government of India Act of 1935.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ponder the ultimate legacy of this super turbulent 4-year period. The events from 1930 to 1934 forced Indian leaders to confront exactly what an independent nation would look like. And crucially, who would actually hold the power within it? So I want to leave you with this profound historical question to chew on. Did agreements like the Purna Pact lay the necessary foundation for united, independent India? Or did they permanently fracture the social fabric and delay true equality? Keep asking questions, and thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.